Just a quick note before we start this video, some of this is obviously recorded here in the studio, others parts of it, in fact a significant portion of it, was recorded live at Western Approaches Command, and unfortunately at the very last minute we were unable to secure the proper camera equipment, so all of this was done very impromptu with basically my home camera. Thus some of the sound quality isn't fantastic and there is a bit of a breeze in some of the outdoor portions. I've done my best to modify volume and cut out wind noise, but some of the audio footage might not be quite up to the same quality that you're used to. I do apologise for that in advance, and hopefully further videos from live locations will not suffer quite the same amount. Now, on with the video. Back in the First World War, one of the keys to defeating the U-boat menace was the adoption of convoys. And quite why this came about as a general tactic late in the war, and how exactly it affected the tide of that particular conflict, is the matter for an entire other video, but it is the starting point for this one. In that conflict, whilst overall direction fell to the First Sea Lord, the day-to-day business of keeping the convoys safe and the U-boats permanently underwater was the responsibility of the Commander-in-Chief, Coast of Ireland, based in what was then called Queenstown, and now called Cobb, in Ireland itself. This was in large part because it was the most geographically proximate Royal Navy base to the Western Approaches. The section of the Atlantic that was so called because, somewhat mundanely, it was the part of the ocean that you sailed to approach the UK coming from the west. In World War I, most German submarines lacked the range to get much further out into the Atlantic and then patrol effectively for an extended period of time. And in any case, the Western Approaches area offered the richest hunting grounds, as ships concentrated in this area before heading to their various ports. But shortly after World War I, the majority of Ireland had become independent, and the new Irish government was not especially keen on a large British naval base persisting on their soil. Thus, responsibility for looking after the Western Approaches would have to be allocated elsewhere. At the start of World War II, this fell to Admiral Martin Dunbar Naismith, who happened to be Commander-in-Chief, Plymouth. Given its proximity to the main route of shipping to both the UK's western coast and the Channel, through which convoys were still being run during World War II, this made a certain amount of sense, and Admiral Dunbar Naismith had a good understanding of the hazards the merchants faced, as he had spent much of his own career as a submariner, including a highly successful tour of the Black Sea against the Ottomans in World War I, which had earned him the Victoria Cross, as well as previously having taken the majority of the British government's senior officials, as well as the King, on an underwater tour in an early submarine pre-World War I. Given the reliability of these early craft, that was something of a potentially history-changing escapade had anything gone wrong. And that place was here, Derby House in Liverpool. At the time, this building was still under construction, and so the Admiralty commandeered it, modified it whilst it was being built to include a massive bunker underneath, and would then take over the entire building for the duration of the war. This would therefore be the new home of Western Approaches Command. There's a number of reasons for this. Just down the road there, literally a 2-3 minute walk away, is the Merseyside docks, and we're going to go and have a look at that just now before we go inside. So a couple of minutes of walk away from Derby House is the Liverpool quayside. This was another reason for relocating Western Approaches Command to this area, because as you can see, this is where the docks would be for the unloading of the convoys, and over there you can see what's now the Camel dockyards, the Royal Navy supply units. But back in the day, those would have been building the escorts and repairing the escorts, amongst other things that would have been supplying the protection for the Royal Navy convoys. And as you can see, part of there is still something of a commercial dockyard space. So this is the entrance to Derby House. Back in the war, you would have had to sign the Official Secrets Act to actually step across this threshold, unless you wanted short trips and cells. And, well, I actually have signed the Official Secrets Act, but that was several years ago for completely unrelated reasons, so we can now go inside regardless of that. So if you were assigned to the bunker part of Derby House, you would actually, in World War II, would come through this door here from the main building, you would have proceeded through this room, and you would have come over here, and through this door, And this door goes straight through the 3-foot thick wall of the bunker. So we're going to go in there in just a minute. And like any good bunker, it of course needed its own power supply. As you can see, some nice big fuse breakers and the main power board just here. These supplied power to the bunker even if everything else outside might have been cut off. We are now under the roof, and the roof above us just here is 7 foot thick. So more than capable of resisting the odd German bomb, especially considering we've got the bulk of Derby House above us, plus a little bit of ground as well. Having overseen the transfer from Plymouth to Liverpool, Admiral Dunbar Naismith would hand over this element of command to Admiral Sir Percy Noble a couple of weeks later. Whilst Admiral Noble was an officer with a distinctly above-surface pedigree, he was nonetheless another capable choice, and he promptly got to work reorganising the convoy escort groups, taking into account the new ships and technology that were becoming available, and then absorbing the lessons that had been learned so far by the existing and new escort formations, and turning them into new training methods and tactics that would lay the basis for future success, along with enhancing a number of bases for the increasing number of escort craft, ranging from corvettes and the Lend-Lease destroyers, all the way up to older battleships that were still in use to deter German surface raiders. Perhaps critical to the success of this new combined command, Noble was very good at getting everyone to agree on a course of action via consensus, which allowed the coordination of navy and air assets in a far superior manner to that displayed in some other joint commands at this time of the war. The joint operation that was supposed to prevent the Channel Dash in particular comes to mind. But why did you need to have combined operations? This here is the RAF plotting room, for example. So what's an RAF room doing in a Royal Navy bunker? Well, RAF Coastal Command, specifically the headquarters of 15 Group RAF, which was part of Coastal Command, was assigned to work with the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines in order to counter the U-boat menace, as many aircraft would be involved in this effort, both in terms of hunting down U-boats, but also in providing search and rescue aircraft using the Sunderland flying boats as well as Catalina boats once they became available from the United States. So why Western Approaches Command? Why not Atlantic Command? Well, it all comes back to World War I, because in World War I the German U-boats were not able to range out quite as far and conduct a full patrol as they would be in World War II. So during the World War I submarine campaign, the most dangerous part of approach for merchant shipping, although there were a few submarines operating in the mid-Atlantic, was this area, the so-called Western Approaches, because, shockingly enough, they are where you approach the United Kingdom if you're coming in from the west. Now, in early 1939, during the start of World War II, Western Approaches Command was attached to Commander-in-Chief Plymouth, which is down here. This makes a certain amount of sense as the convoys were coming up this way to split to either go to the UK's west coast or to go up the Channel, as Channel convoys were still very much a thing back then. However, the fall of France in 1940 meant that ships coming up in this direction would be coming suicidally close to German air bases and potentially U-boat bases as well. Obviously, with the fall of Vichy France later in the war, this would get a lot more complicated. And so the convoys had to be rerouted, but there's Ireland in the way. So the convoys had to be rerouted up, over, through the top, round the top of Ireland, and down. And this is where we are here in Liverpool. And so it made a lot more sense for Western Approaches Command to be relocated to the port city where most of those convoys would be coming in, and where, of course, reports and intelligence could be gathered directly, even whilst ships that might have been damaged were being repaired. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a stick long enough to poke at this part of the board, but you can see all the way up above me the effect that the fall of France actually had. Because if we pan a little bit to the right, you can see there's the UK, and you can see that actually most of the convoy routing coming up from America did a big, long northern arc to stay as far away as possible from Luftwaffe bases and easy U-boat deployment from the coast of France. as after all, the Type 7s and the Type 9s and other U-boats were causing enough problems without inviting additional attacks from shorter range coastal U-boats that might have been possible if the old routing had been maintained. Now, this is one of the radio rooms that was used to communicate both with London and the other military headquarters, but also with the ships and escort groups that are out there. We'll see a few of these other rooms elsewhere in the bunker, but whereas nowadays we might have something along these lines, a little bit of a mobile communications technology, back then it was a little bit chunkier and a little bit more analog. You've got switchboards, you've got the phone. This particular unit is directed to Ashford. We've got our pulse radio, and of course we have all our power monitoring. And just in case you've forgotten how it all worked, there are also some handy bits of paper on the walls that instructed you on how to repair and reset everything should something get knocked out of alignment. A secondary reason for relocating the command to Liverpool was that Liverpool was slightly less vulnerable to the Luftwaffe than Plymouth was. Plymouth obviously very close to occupied airfields in France, and whilst Liverpool, as you can see from these Luftwaffe targeting maps, was hardly immune to bombing, to get to Liverpool, Luftwaffe bombers had to come a lot further, which made them more vulnerable as fighters escort would usually have to turn back before they got here, and they'd also have to come across pretty much most of England, and there was a rather angry group of RAF pilots defending it, so bomber raids that reached here generally suffered more from the attentions of RAF fighters and night fighters, which reduced the risk to this building and its vital command staff just a little bit, as much as anywhere in the UK was safe-ish from the Luftwaffe's attentions at the time. But of course, we're also under a bunker, so just in case. This is part of the teleprinter room. This is where a lot of messages would be decoded before being passed through to the main control hub. So you can see here we have a variety of instrumentation that would all be used to decode messages both coming in from Bletchley Park, from central government, from other aspects of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, but also direct transmissions from the convoy escorts where at all possible. Now we're just going to go through this glass window and have a look at some of the rest of the equipment. Here we see another part of the teleprinter-telecommunications room. This is part of the exchange room, and as you can see with the old school equipment and the old school switchboard, this is where a lot of communications will be coming in. Now, although high-powered radio sets were common in World War II and got increasingly more common as time went on, the simple fact of the matter was, one, they still weren't ubiquitous, and two, they could be intercepted, whereas a landline transmission is a lot harder to pick up if you happen to be in a German listening post in France. And so these units, there are 4 of them here and there are more elsewhere, would be used to bring in most of the telecommunications that were coming into the bunker, and also to send orders out as much as possible to the main transmitting and encoding stations where these orders had to be transmitted out to sea. So all of those rooms that we saw downstairs, where the teleprinter room, the secure communications room, etc., those would all come up to here. This is the main exchange, and this is where those signals and phone calls would be relayed out to the various transmitter stations. There's also a radar arm back here, just to let everyone know if there was an air raid going on. Not that you probably notice it too much once you're in the bunker itself, which obviously is down these stairs. Whereas in the teleprinter and telecommunications rooms, most of the orders and messages would be received, the most secret coded messages would be received in this small room here. Because they were so sensitive, mostly signals intelligence from Bletchley Park, the operator would actually be locked in this room with an armed guard stationed outside. You then had to wait for the priority messages to arrive. They would come in on the encoded strips, which you can see on the left-hand side just sticking out of the left-hand side machine, and they would then have to be further decoded because, of course, once the German messages had been decoded, they would be re-encoded under an Allied cipher to be transmitted here so that nobody got any wind of the fact the Enigma code had been broken. We're now in one of 2 rooms that overlook the main plotting room. This cabin is for use by the Royal Navy, and the one just next to it, which we'll have a look at later, is used by the Royal Air Force. Whilst all the reports and plots will be kept live by the various desks and phones out there, here is where the officers of the Navy and Air Force would keep an eye on everything and then communicate any new findings that they needed to send to their various respective units without disrupting the work of the constant plotting. The information here would then be relayed upstairs to the radio room, which we'll go and have a look at as well. This work could be especially vital because if a U-boat was detected close enough, then aircraft could be scrambled and dispatched to intercept and sink it before it got anywhere near a convoy. Here in the main plotting room, officers from the Royal Navy, Royal Marines and Royal Air Force would work to synthesise the reports from aerial recon, the escorts, the convoy ships themselves, as well as signals intelligence from Bletchley Park. This would all be put together on this map here, and as you can see there's a couple of sliding ladders that would allow people to go physically up and down the ladder to plot the new course corrections. This obviously being in a pre-computer age, everything had to be done manually. Once all of this was established, they could look at trying to redirect convoys to try and avoid the U-boat wolf packs if at all possible, and if it wasn't possible, to alert the escorts of roughly how many U-boats to expect and when to expect them. This was a very careful balance that they had to strike, as if the U-boats found that the seas were magically clear of all targets, it would be very, very obvious to them that their signals had been compromised. Whereas if they did nothing with the signals intelligence and all the plotting they'd done here, then of course the convoys would run straight into the U-boats and it would be practically worthless to have all that intelligence in the first place. All of this would come to a head in early 1944, where despite the best efforts as well as the new tactics developed here, shipping losses were approaching a point that looked to be a tipping point to becoming unsustainable. The U-boats were just arriving in more and more numbers and their techniques and tactics were developing faster than Western Approaches Command could counter. However, April and May 1943 would indeed prove to be a tipping point, but not in the direction that it had looked like at the beginning of the year. Thanks in large part to the tactics and techniques developed here, as well as new technology and larger and more powerful forms of escorts, a number of convoys were attacked, but the key tipping point is generally held to be convoy ONS-5, whose route is plotted just here. ONS-5 was a slow convoy that would end up being attacked by a combined force of two wolf packs that had a total of 43 U-boats to call on. The convoy itself only had 42 merchant ships, so there were actually more U-boats available than there were merchant ships to sink, albeit that the combined two wolf packs couldn't actually bring all of their U-boats to bear at once, and indeed some of them were just too far out of range. The convoy itself, however, although it would have a total of just over a dozen escorts over its entire sailing period, only had about just over half a dozen at any given time, which meant that the escorts were outnumbered quite heavily by the number of U-boats that were actually available to come in. However, whilst it should have been a slaughter, and indeed 13 of the merchant vessels were lost, the U-boat arm took equal losses. 6 U-boats were sunk outright, and another 7 were so badly damaged that they had to retreat back to France for repairs, with a number of them being intercepted by other Allied assets en route, with a few more being sunk as a result. Trading vessel for vessel was completely unsustainable for the Kriegsmarine, especially since the Liberty ships and Victory ships were coming down the slipways far faster than Germany could resupply U-boats, to say nothing of the loss of the trained and skilled U-boat crews that were going down every time a U-boat was destroyed. Also available in 1943 were large numbers of new purpose-built escorts that had been diverted off to the invasion fleet that had taken part in Operation Torch in late 1942. This flood of new craft, along with other advancements such as centimetric radar, airborne surface search radar that was fine enough to pick up a U-boat periscope, as well as radar-guided searchlights, all contributed to the Wolfpacks being driven from the seas by the middle of 1943. A massive change from what it had looked like as late as March 1943, when it was thought that Britain might just be brought to its knees by the number of ships that were being sunk. Also thrown into the fight in this period were increasing numbers of merchant aircraft carriers, which were merchant hulls that had a simple flight deck installed, as well as purpose-built escort carriers, mostly coming down the slipways from American shipyards, and of course aircraft. You can see here vast numbers of different types of aircraft were being used. You've got Wellingtons, Halifaxes, Sunderlands, Seafires, Beauforts, and some as well as Catalinas. Now, all of these aircraft had been in service in one way, shape or form for a number of years, but key to closing the mid-Atlantic gap, which was an area, surprisingly enough, in the mid-Atlantic where aircraft couldn't quite reach, was the aircraft whose symbol up there is the white arrow, the B-24 Liberator. It would be anti-submarine versions of this aircraft, deployed in increasing numbers, again from the United States, as well as allocated to RAF Coastal Command, that would close this gap and present a significant problem for U-boats who had previously used this area as a relatively safe place to surface and recharge their batteries, as well as make radio reports back to Kriegsmarine headquarters. That wasn't the end of the threat entirely, however. New technologies and tactics were constantly being developed by the Germans as well, with zigzagging torpedoes, acoustic wake-homing torpedoes, and improved types of U-boats, including water and electric boats, all coming into service, as well as flak boats that were designed to engage the very pesky Allied aircraft that were being coordinated from this facility as well. But Western Approaches Command and the Western Approaches Tactical Unit upstairs would prove to be more than equal to the task. A German attempt to revive their general offensive in late 1943 led to the loss of over 36 U-boats for minimal losses to merchant ships. This was the first time that the escorts had managed to trade U-boats for merchant ships at a better than 1-to-1 ratio, which was something that pleased the officers, men and Wrens assigned to this station no end. They would even manage to develop countermeasures to the acoustic homing torpedoes the Germans had developed, which would allow escorts to relatively reliably evade these weapons, thus obviating most of the point of deploying them, which had been to kill the escorts in the first place, thus making it easier for the rest of the convoy to be attacked by more conventional weapons. And this was all prior to the introduction of things like noisemakers and towed decoys. Having overseen the transfer of command from Plymouth to Liverpool, Admiral Dunbar Naismith then handed over command to Admiral Sir Percy Noble. However, in 1942, Admiral Noble was in turn replaced by Admiral Max Horton. Like Admiral Dunbar Naismith, Horton had enjoyed a highly successful career as a submariner in World War I, albeit he'd gone on to command a series of surface ships in the interwar period and then gone back to his roots, spending the first few years of World War II as Rear Admiral of submarines. During this period, he had submitted and seen through the concept of the convoy rescue ship. This took a small, but for a merchant relatively fast ship, usually a freighter, that already had some passenger carrying capability and enhanced this, as well as the onboard food storage and preparation facilities, as well as installing medical facilities. The ship's boats were replaced with larger ones that were more suited to work in open seas, as well as large nets for men to climb aboard when these were deployed over the sides of the hull, and these were pre-installed in ready launch positions. In this manner, around 150 men could be accommodated in addition to the ship's crew, and the use of the smaller vessels meant that they were less likely to be targeted when a U-boat had a range of options to choose from, such as large freighters and tankers. Now appointed as the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches Command, there were a further series of evolutions in the way that escort ships were going to be used, in part dictated by the rising numbers of available ships and their improved technological capabilities, and in part due to the continuing work of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, which we'll come to later. Bear in mind, Horton was a very effective submarine commander, but in war games, the new tactics that had developed by the Wrens of WATU managed to sink a U-boat that was under his control with alarming regularity. One of the changes that they introduced was the introduction of support groups. Whereas the normal escort groups were tied to convoys, support groups would travel with a convoy that was deemed to be at increased risk, but would normally be made up of slightly swifter vessels than the corvettes and other convoy-bound escorts. These would have the authority to leave the convoys to continue the pursuit of detected submarines for as long as was needed. This, it should be noted, was partly as a result of Horton's experience, allowing him to think in the role of both escort and submarine captain at the same time, but also thanks to the increase in escort numbers and critically in the numbers of faster and more capable escorts such as the Hunt class. Whilst much of this activity would take place above ground in Derby House, the heart of the day-to-day operations, and indeed night-to-night operations, took place underground in the bunker. As well as being airtight, the massive construction of the bunker allowed the men and women of Western Approaches Command to work on through any Luftwaffe raids without much fear of being hit. It's largely thanks to this massive construction that we still have the museum, as the central core of the bunker network proved far too costly and difficult to demolish post-war, which allowed it to survive long enough for people to take an interest into turning it into a museum, even though only a small part of the original complex is actually open to visitors. This is the office, and indeed the desk, of the commanding officer of Western Approaches. For most of the period, as we've mentioned, this was Admiral Max Horton. And as you can see, there's some golf balls on the table because he was an avid golfer. There's also some golf clubs over there in the corner, but that's another matter. He of course has his telephones and his switchboard of his own. His bunk is just behind us over there, and he has a study through there, units here, and as you can see if we pan over to look to the right, he has a direct overview of the command centre. This was critical as Admiral Horton would spend a good few years of his life here, literally sleeping 10 feet ahead of me, or behind the camera, coming into here and observing the convoys and the battles that went on constantly. This was a very key feature of the bunker because you've got to remember that whilst a lot of the intelligence and the general work would be done during the day, a lot of the convoy battles themselves would take place at night. And so, since the Kriegsmarine didn't go off work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it was vitally important that the key minds behind the anti-submarine effort would be able to be in contact and direct the battle as much as they could, at least from over here in Liverpool, at any time of day. So this was Admiral Horton's sleeping quarters. And as you can see, you just have a bed, wash basin, another telephone, just in case the one that's just over there wasn't close enough. But this was fairly austere, only a slight upgrade over what everybody else had. This is a typical accommodation room for the Wrens, who formed most of the staff here at Western Approaches Command. As you can see, exactly the same kind of bed design that Admiral Horton had. It's just bunk beds, so there's two of them and a slightly smaller room. Same standard military issue wash basin, and they get a telephone as well. This area is again off limits to the public in general, and this is more of the accommodation quarters, just around the corner from the accommodation quarters we just had a look at. This will eventually become part of a Wren museum commemorating their efforts in the war, but at the moment, as you can see, has only just been reopened. There's an old tin bath and a few other bits and pieces, but not a lot of interest at the minute. Now, this is a relatively unremarkable exit passageway, also it might appear. You see, one of the things that isn't on this museum tour is the rifle range, but a lot of the Wrens who served here when interviewed have mentioned a rifle range quite a bit. Now, you might think, where is that rifle range? Well, we don't know yet, but there is one clue. You see, here's the floor, and if I stand here, it's pretty solid. Ow, that actually hurt. But if I take a couple of steps over here, it's hollow. So there's something under here. Now, that is something for future exploration, but you never know, there might be an entire rifle range down there. Now, I've made mention of the Wrens and the Western Approaches Tactical Command Unit, or WATU, and you might have thought, oh, I'm not going to mention them much further. Well, you'd be wrong. This is all about them. One of the key aspects to Admiral Noble's tenure was the introduction of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, in January 1942. They were created specifically to analyse the way current battles against the U-boats were being fought, and then develop and distribute new ideas and methods to better counteract German efforts against the precious convoys. Now, WATU was assigned most of the top floor of Derby House, but sadly that's since been converted to offices and we can only tell you the story and not show it. The Royal Navy had entered World War II, assuming, or perhaps hoping would be more accurate, that U-boat tactics would be similar to those seen at the end of World War I. They developed what they called ASDIC, and we now call sonar, in order to counter submarines, and some thought this invention would obviate the risk from submarine attack as long as merchant ships were confined to convoys. However, others, especially those who'd conducted exercises with the Royal Navy's own submarines, were somewhat more sceptical of this, and indeed the new German U-boat fleet had improved its technology and adapted its tactics in anticipation of having to attack convoys. In particular, they'd developed the wolf pack tactic. This had first been tried in late World War I, but had proved so disastrous that the Royal Navy hadn't actually even noticed, and the High Seas Fleet had abandoned it. Interwar exercises had improved the idea significantly though, and despite some false starts, it was well in effect shortly after the start of World War II. From signals intelligence, in part related to efforts against Enigma, the British knew U-boats were operating in a coordinated fashion, but not exactly what this entailed. Now, contrary to popular myth, a wolf pack generally did not involve a formation of U-boats cruising en masse against a convoy. Apart from anything else, that would be a recipe for friendly fire and heavy losses in most cases. Instead, a pack would be deployed in a patrol line across the expected route of a convoy. When one submarine spotted the convoy, the others would then be directed to join the attack. Thus, the number of submarines in range, and when they arrived, would vary. This was actually far more taxing on the escorts, as a single large set-piece engagement would be hard, but manageable for a decent-sized escort group. But constant single attacks on different vectors day and night for days at a time could wear down even the most hardened escort crews and cause mistakes to be made through sheer fatigue, if nothing else. But a submarine underwater was still slower than a convoy, so the submarines must have some constraints on how, when, and where they could attack from. In order to work out how this all worked, reverse engineer the tactics, and thus devise countermeasures, in early 1942 the WATU was formed under Commander Gilbert Roberts and assigned to Derby House. Largely staffed from the Women's Royal Naval Service, or Wrens, they used literal tabletop, or rather floor-level, wargaming to counter the Kriegsmarine's U-boats. The wargames were conducted on the top floor of Derby House using a large brown lino floor as the game board. A grid at 10 inches square to 1 mile would be drawn out, and various models signifying serviced U-boats and serviced ships would be placed. The courses of the U-boats would be plotted, but in a green chalk that was very difficult to see when viewed from an angle. The Wrens and, if necessary, officers who were commanding the quote-unquote escort ships would only be able to see the board using these. These canvas screens would block their ability to actually see the board in general, although those commanding the U-boats could see the entire board. If an escort wanted to have a look, they'd have to have a look through one of these tiny little 2-inch slits like this. And trust me, that view is very restricted. There's also this removable red film to simulate nighttime conditions. Put that back there. Now this, you could say, gave something of an unfair advantage to a U-boat operator because the U-boat commander, at least in simulation, could see everything that was going on, whereas the escorts could only have this limited view. The limited view was fairly realistic because obviously on an escort you can only see a limited part of the ocean. But the idea was that if a tactic could be developed that could defeat someone who was commanding a U-boat who could literally see anything, who was using Das Panopticon, then surely the tactic would work a lot better against a U-boat commander who was more limited by the bounds of reality. But how exactly does one defeat the single greatest threat to the UK's existence with some model ships and a grid square board? First, the team reviewed the various encounter and battle reports that had come in from the escorting ships that arrived in the UK. Second, using these reports, they recreated the actions as best they could. Using known performance specifications of German U-boats, they would then be able to extrapolate what the Germans were doing to show up in the locations and at the times that were recorded by the escorts. Thirdly, having reverse engineered the particular encounter, they would play out new battles using the tactics that they'd derived, only now with the ability to anticipate what might happen and thus devise countermeasures. Fourth, once the countermeasures had been played out and proven successful repeatedly in exercise, you would disseminate these tactics to the escort ship commanders for use in the future. This had a number of advantages. The actions could be played out again and again without putting any lives at risk, increasing the number of passes at working out what the escort should ideally be doing. And also, because this was a war game, it was possible to stop, analyse and think repeatedly if needed, without the concerns of ongoing attacks, weather, rescue efforts and the like that operational ships would have to concern themselves with. Once a successful countermeasure was worked out, serving officers would be invited to take part in the war games to help them both understand what the enemy was doing and what they could do about it. British officers made up most of these trainees, but serving officers from almost every other Allied navy would also take part, with the notable exception of the US Navy, as Admiral King barred his officers from formally learning anything from the Royal Navy when it came to this field of operations. That didn't, however, stop a number of enterprising US officers turning up on Sunday, when ostensibly everybody was off work, in order to pick up a few tips and tricks. The war games themselves were based on a rule set which was the original purpose behind the publication of Jane's fighting ships, and in many ways the first versions of this publication could very much be seen as a Codex Real-World Navy, and with an ever-changing rule set as well as expansions and discontinued units courtesy of the various naval powers. Two of the biggest successes to come out of the department were the raspberry and beta search techniques. The first came about through reverse engineering how a submarine could sink a ship in the middle of a convoy without being noticed. By strictly adhering to rules laid down by operational requirements, it was discovered that the only way that this could happen was by a submarine running on the surface at night, coming in from the rear of the convoy, torpedoing its target, and then submerging and falling back. This was required due to the fact that, slow as a convoy normally was, a submerged U-boat was even slower, and the flanks and front of a convoy were usually far more heavily guarded, whereas the rear was rarely checked. This allowed the submarine to potentially reload and come back for another go, again and again, until it ran out of torpedoes or targets. With this realisation, escorts were ordered to drop back and form a line behind the convoy if a ship in the middle randomly exploded at night. They would then run search patterns waiting for the submarine to drop back out of the convoy underwater and depth charge it from an unexpected direction. Sure enough, a steady string of U-boat kills began to accrue from this method. The other tactic was called beta search. This was devised after an interview with a captain of HMS Harvester, who had noticed that some U-boats would be seen hovering ahead of a convoy, reporting its position. Sometime thereafter, a signal would be detected nearby, almost certainly a sighting report from a submarine that was about to engage. The initial instinct upon detecting a U-boat was to charge it down and do everything possible to kill it. The submarine would then try to evade, of course, and could be successful in this, as escorts couldn't stray too far away from the convoy for risk of another U-boat slipping through a gap in the defences. So all the submarine had to do was to stay ahead of the depth charges long enough for the escort to be forced to break off, or better still, just evade. But if the sub evaded early, it would try and sidle around the convoy to attack from astern. Thus, instead, an escort would charge the U-boat, but not attempt immediate engagement. The submarine's captain would instinctively order his ship to dive, seeing an escort charging at him, and the escort would then sail past, convincing the U-boat crew that they'd managed to dive early enough to evade discovery underwater. It would then predictably try to sneak around the side of the convoy, but as it drew closer, the noise of the convoy's propellers would be very loud. This would mask the true intent of the other escorts, which would be quietly making their way to the same estimated location, and then all of a sudden depth charges and ASDIC would be launched, and the first thing the U-boat knew was the world was exploding around it. Other tactics were also calculated as German responses to these were analysed. Most were codenamed for fruit. Pineapple, for instance, was designed to deal with situations where there really were a group of U-boats lying in wait ahead. This involved the escorts charging out at full speed, forcing the submarines to dive. The more cautious would then break off and would just be passed by, whilst the more cunning would take advantage of the escort's high speed to simply move past them, while speed interfered with Aztec systems resolution. But the second part of the tactic was for a number of escorts to double back once the subs were known to have dived and couldn't see them, and then quietly work their own way back towards the convoy, ready to jump onto any Aztec contact that appeared from a sneaky U-boat. And it must be remembered that the vast majority of this work was done by the Wrens, who not only had never been to sea in a submarine before, but indeed, at the time, could not go to sea in a submarine before. It gives you some idea of just how effective both the operational method that they used was, and just how smart these women were, in that they managed to reverse engineer the tactics of very experienced Kriegsmarine submarine commanders, and then develop counter-tactics that would prove to be highly effective, as we said, despite never actually going aboard, or in some cases even seeing a submarine. And so to wrap things up, I thought it would be a good idea to have a chat with the director of the museum, both about Western Approach's command in the war, as well as how it became a museum and what the future holds for it. So we're joined here by the director of Western Approach's Command Museum. So if you could say hello.
Hi, I'm Dean from Western Approaches, and my role is opening and shutting the doors and making sure this building is accessible to the public, and that the story of the Battle of the Atlantic and Western Approaches is told.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing your time with us today. Now, obviously, this was a bunker. This was used as a command centre, and then for a very long period of time, it wasn't. It was shut down just after the war. It was found a bit too difficult to demolish because they made it bomb-proof. So when did it come back into being a museum as it is now, and how long did that take? What was that like?
So there's some of the story we know. Some of the stories got gaps in we're still trying to fill. So we know at the end of 1945, officially the building was boarded up, and it went back into private ownership. So effectively Derby House Exchange Flags was in private ownership, but was commandeered by the Admiralty during the war. So it went back into private ownership. This specific area, this bunker, was boarded, bricked up. Everything was removed, all the paperwork was removed anyway. We know then it was rediscovered in the very late 80s, early 90s by a new landlord who bought the building, who had a bit of a kind of penchant for the Second World War. So when he knocked through and discovered this room, obviously the top of Derby House, the top floors, that it was known that they were naval officers during the war. But when this was discovered, that they had this bunker, he went about making plans to open it to the public and turn it into a museum. Unfortunately, he was a character, is probably the best description of this landlord. He went bust in the end, and it was forcibly, it had to be sold. So the museum kind of closed again. A new landlord bought the building in 2017, and Big Heritage, which is the social enterprise that runs Western Approaches, which I founded, we took on the lease of the building. So for about 2.5 years we've had it, and now sees about 30,000-40,000 visitors a year, so it's growing steadily. We do have some gaps in that story. So in between obviously 1945 and 1989, apparently nothing was happening, but we've found, certainly on the higher floor, some paperwork relating into the 50s and into the early 60s actually, and we suspect like a couple of kind of Second World War fortified or bunkered sites that they were kept up to some extent with the threat of the Cold War. Some of these were kind of kept in some running condition, if you like, just in case that there was any further war, which obviously didn't happen. So we do wonder when any other official secret acts kind of end, that we might find a little bit more of the story of Western Approaches.
Okay, thank you. And so obviously all of this has been restored. I noticed obviously the battle ONS-5, the turning point of the Atlantic, or a battle of the Atlantic is portrayed there. Are there any other interesting bits and pieces of history of the bunker or history of the Battle of the Atlantic that you might want to share with us?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting place. So obviously we got a set of keys effectively in 2017, and a set of building plans that were written up in 1990. As an archaeologist, and most of our team are kind of historians or archaeologists, we don't really settle on just what's in front of you. So we went and dug into our own research and found 1940s plans for the bunker, which suggested there was more rooms, more space than there were on 90s plans. We had these kind of vague gaps that were missing. So we actually discovered there's about 20% more to the building and more rooms than we'd signed the lease for. So it's quite exciting. Some of them are only just kind of opening because we've had to have them cleared from asbestos, but we have a room that was directly linked into Bletchley Park, so it was a decoding room. If you think of Bletchley Park, deciphering the enigma and getting these messages, then translating them from German to English, then they'd have to scramble them again to send them to this room here, basically. So all of that information from Bletchley was their work was hugely important, but the data and information was being used here. So we have a room, which we'll show you in a minute, which was directly linked to Bletchley. That was only opened a few months ago, really, it's still not open to the public, so we can show you that. But the whole place is kind of a hidden gem. We keep finding things, and the social history for me is the interesting bit about Western approaches. So it's not about the big battles per se or the grand strategies. It's finding little notes off people. It's finding sweet wrappers down the sides of radiators that have been there since the 40s. We found a scrolled up telegram which someone had written, and we unfurled it, and it said, "I'd just like to let you know that you are a complete bastard." And someone's obviously sent a bit of a fun joke telegram, thrown it away and forgotten about, and 70 odd years later we find it down the side of the radiator. So from grand discoveries of hidden rooms through to offensive messages, there's a lot to be discovered.
Cool, awesome.
So when we took over the building, this room was closed off. There was a wall all the way along here, and on our plans there was just a corridor leading to the room through there. But then when we discovered these plans from 1942, this room was a decoding room, and then a few clues started to come into place. So if you look in the room where we have Morse code machines now, they have the same tubes going along with the same equally spaced uprights. Now, what they are in the other room is they are stations for lamps, where curved lamps would come out. There'd be a desk along there and machines were placed on. So we saw this corridor and thought, hang on a second, there's no way you'd have desks in a room this narrow. And so we ended up taking this wall down. From the plans we discovered that there was a wider room, took this wall down, and lo and behold, you can see that's the rest of the desks there. You can see the lamps coming down, and what's fantastic is it's pristine paint colours, so we've got the original colours. So in the 1990s, when they opened the museum, the landlord there there was a lot of pastiche, kind of making things up as they went along, and the paint colours and everything were all over the place. So what was great for us was to find this, this is original, paint, so we can match things back up to it. And even little things like, I wonder what was on the wall. Well, we know what's on this wall because they obviously had a map on here. And in the 40s, before they put it on, someone scribbled map, so they know that's where the map's going to go. So, and there's cable tunnels, which you can see. In fact, that's one there, and these run straight under the street and link up straight directly. I'm not sure what the technology is behind it, but this is one of the rooms directly linked to Whitehall and Bletchley Park. So it's our intention, this is our next project now, to get this back and restored as it was. If you think of the messages that came through here, it's incredible. It does kind of still put shivers down me. I work every day. You think you watch the Imitation Game, or you look at the work they were doing there, and actually, for all the great work they did, the crux of it, the information, the big decisions were made in this building, and this is where all this came in. So it's a piece of history, really.
So the two different paint colours, I guess, the 90s paint and the...
Yeah, it's that ubiquitous British green that was on every kind of government building. But yeah, no, it's games. And to be honest, what's amazing, if you have a look at this, you can pick this up on the camera, we pulled this away today. This is where we found cigarette wrappers and everything. Can you see there's like a chicken wire all the way? So it's a Faraday cage. The whole room is a giant Faraday cage. So what that meant, what that prevented, was interference from radio or from anything leaching out as well. So this we've discovered this in a few other rooms now, where basically we've found doors that have got kind of copper lining around them, and we've kind of realised that a lot of it was around keeping either radio waves from interfering with each other or stopping them going or being intercepted. So this is pristine, it's not been touched for us, and you know, even the light bulbs and stuff are still in there.
So good project for the future.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we have got an actual strip of this here in a couple of storerooms that we can't reuse. We're going to actually cut a couple of these out and create some really fancy lamps, and I think they'd be very, very sought after to have a lamp at home that was the lamps from Western Approaches. So, but yeah, it's a work in progress, to say the least. It's clear of asbestos, that's cost us thousands to do that, so it's getting this one open and ready. It's a pretty cool little room. We're going to get one working, I think, eventually, because the sound of them is amazing with them clicking away, but we've managed to, we worked out what this was off plans and photographs, what's in here. Again, we cleared all the asbestos out of it, but it's a whopper of a job to get this all restored, but this was another room. This wasn't on our plans. We broke into this door to get this, but it goes right the way down the back of the wall. So yeah, in fact, the last visitor who came in here was Willie Johnson, who is the United States ambassador. So he come to visit Liverpool a couple of months ago, and has his family have a history with the Lend-Lease program, etc. And he kind of come to pay pilgrimage, if you like, at Western Approaches, and he's a gentleman who's absolutely loved the place. And he said about this room, he said, I understand why you're restoring it, but he said it's almost a shame because it's nice for visitors to kind of, if you get a secret viewing behind the scenes, it's like something special when all of a sudden, so you know, restoring everything kind of loses that mystique to it. But we assured them there's plenty more space to explore.
Yeah, you've all the sort of tick tape coding
Yeah.
messages and the decoding machines and everything.
Exactly.
Here. Oh, thank you very much.
We've got reams of paper. I actually said to one of the staff we should probably capitalise on some of that and start printing letters or something to people, or you can buy a letter pack from the original paper from Western Approaches. It's
Convoy dispatches.
Yeah, well, that's, I'm sure there was probably all sorts of just mundane rubbish getting printed on it as well, but I think if you'd have a roll of paper that's come from Western Approaches, the original, it might be souvenir worthy.
Yeah, definitely.
Looks nice, like that.
And once you actually got out of the bunker into daylight, you might see a scene a bit like this. Now, of course, this isn't actually above ground. They've had to recreate it in a spare section of the bunker, but oh well. There was, of course, rationing in effect. Some fresh fruit and vegetables that might come straight out of the local fields would still be here, obviously. And, of course, propaganda posters all over the place. There was, of course, also collections, the old scraps for the pig squills. You've got the sweet shop over there, and if you were really unlucky, you might wake up one morning and find one of these waiting for you. This particular one is a £1,000 German bomb, obviously not exploded, and hopefully won't explode. I'm relatively sure it's a prop, but I'm not going to give it a kick in any case. And all of this would have been the typical sight that might greet an officer or a Wren when they came up from the bunker to see daylight for the first time, possibly in weeks. And that concludes this brief history of Western Approaches Command and our tour of the facility, at least this time round. Now, as with many UK museums that have suffered under the lockdown, they have been closed for a number of months, but they are aiming to reopen in late July or early August. So if you happen to be in the UK or visiting the UK and are within reasonable distance of Liverpool, keep an eye on their website, link in the description down below. And as and when they're reopened, I strongly advise you to go and give them a little bit of support, have a look around the museum, and see what you can see. There's certainly a lot more interesting history to learn, and although this video is approaching an hour, you could spend quite easily 2 to 3 hours or more looking through the museum and reading up on even more of the vital work that the men and women of Western Approaches Command did. And who knows, they might even have found a few more secret chambers like the rifle range by then.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.
Okay, rolling.
So the building is 6 floors tall generally, and you can just see there that little off-kilter bit is an additional section that goes even further up. The Western Approaches tactical unit, when the construction's finished, no,
Just start with
the building as a whole is about 6 floors tall, not including anything underground. Really?
Yes, apparently. Oh wow.
Someone doesn't know how to drive.
At least it goes down fast.
So the entire building is about 6 floors high. That's not including the underground sections, obviously, and that